The fluorescent lights of Miller's hardware store buzzed overhead as Sarah Chen arranged the paint samples for the third time that morning. At 28, she had perfected the art of making herself invisible, shoulders hunched forward, eyes fixed on whatever task demanded her attention, movements quick and efficient to avoid lingering conversations with customers. The October wind rattled the windows of the small-town Minnesota store, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of another harsh winter. Sarah pulled her oversized cardigan tighter around her slight frame as the bell above the entrance chimed, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, one of Millbrook's most prominent residents and certainly its most outspoken. "Good morning, Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the store, with the kind of forced sweetness that made Sarah's stomach clench. "I need some advice about kitchen cabinet hardware." Sarah nodded, leading the older woman toward the display of knobs and handles. She'd learned long ago that the faster she helped customers, the sooner they'd leave, taking their pitying glances and whispered comments with them. "You know," Mrs. Henderson began, examining a brass handle with exaggerated interest, "my nephew David is visiting from Minneapolis next week. He's 32, works in accounting, never been married. Perhaps you two might." She let the suggestion hang in the air like a spider's web. Sarah's hand stilled on the display case. "That's very kind of you to think of me, Mrs. Henderson, but I'm quite content as I am." "Oh, nonsense!" Mrs. Henderson waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Every woman needs a husband, though, I suppose." She paused, her eyes scanning Sarah's face with the clinical assessment of someone appraising livestock. "Well, you'd need to do something about your appearance first. Maybe some makeup? That birthmark on your cheek is quite prominent. And your nose? Well, there are procedures for that sort of thing nowadays." The familiar burn of shame spread across Sarah's chest like spilled coffee. The port wine stain that covered the left side of her face from her temple to her jaw had been her unwelcome companion since birth, a purple-red map of difference that marked her as other in a world that prized conventional beauty above all else. "These brass handles are very popular," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They'll complement your oak cabinets nicely." Mrs. Henderson selected 3 different styles, paid quickly, and left with a final comment that felt like a slap. "You really should consider what I said, dear. Time isn't on your side, and at your age, you can't afford to be too picky." The bell's chime seemed to echo long after Mrs. Henderson disappeared down Main Street. Sarah stood frozen by the hardware display, her reflection caught in the polished surface of a cabinet door. The fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows across her face, emphasizing every flaw that small-town gossips had catalogued over the years. She remembered being 7 years old, standing in this same spot when her father first brought her to work during summer vacation. A group of teenagers had been browsing the spray paint section, and one of them, Jenny Morrison, now Jenny Patterson, mother of 3 and president of the PTA, had pointed at Sarah and declared loudly, "My mom says that girl will never get married because no man wants to wake up to that face every morning." The words had lodged themselves in Sarah's chest like splinters, and 21 years later, they still ached when the weather changed. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as Sarah methodically organized inventory, finding comfort in the predictable order of nuts, bolts, and screws. Her father had taught her that everything in the hardware store had its place, its purpose, its value, even the oddly shaped pieces that didn't seem to fit anywhere at first glance. "If only people were like hardware," she murmured to herself, sorting washers by size. "Then everyone would understand that different doesn't mean worthless." The bell chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see Michael Torres entering with his usual Tuesday routine. The local contractor was one of the few customers who treated her like a person rather than a curiosity or a pity case. His work boots clicked against the worn linoleum as he approached the counter. "Afternoon, Sarah. I need 2 dozen 3-inch deck screws and some weatherproofing stain for the Johnson project." "The cedar or the redwood stain?" Sarah asked, grateful for the straightforward interaction. "Cedar." Mrs. Johnson changed her mind about the color scheme again. Michael shook his head with good-natured exasperation. "3rd time this month." As Sarah gathered his order, Michael leaned against the counter with the casual ease of someone comfortable in his own skin. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who built things with his hands and took pride in work well done. "You know," he said, watching her work, "you've got the best organizational system I've ever seen. Every contractor in 3 counties knows to come here when they need something specific fast." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment this time, but from the unfamiliar warmth of genuine appreciation. My father always said efficiency was the key to good customer service. Your father was a smart man. He'd be proud of how you've kept this place running. Michael's voice carried a sincerity that made Sarah's throat tight with unexpected emotion. After Michael left, Sarah found herself thinking about the difference between his easy manner and Mrs. Henderson's calculating assessment. She wondered what it would feel like to walk through the world with Michael's confidence, to occupy space without apology, to be seen for what she offered rather than what she lacked. The day wore on with its familiar rhythm of customers, deliveries, and paperwork. As closing time approached, Sarah swept the floor with mechanical precision, her mind wandering to the romance novels she read in the evenings. Stories of women who were loved, not despite their flaws, but because of the strength they'd gained from overcoming them. She was locking the cash register when she heard the sound that would change everything. A white cane tapping against the sidewalk outside, accompanied by measured footsteps and a voice speaking softly to what sounded like a guide dog. The bell chimed one final time that day as a tall man with prematurely grey hair entered the store. His German shepherd stayed close by his side, alert and focused. The man's movements were careful but confident, and his unseeing eyes seemed to look right through the fluorescent glare to something deeper. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. "I'm looking for someone who might be able to help me find specific hardware for a Braille typewriter restoration. I was told this was the most knowledgeable hardware store in the area." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, struck by the gentle authority in his voice and the way he held himself, not as someone diminished by blindness, but as someone who had learned to navigate the world through different senses entirely. I might be able to help," she said finally. "What kind of hardware are you looking for?" "Small springs, precision screws, and if you have any vintage brass fittings, that would be wonderful. The typewriter belonged to my grandmother. She was blind from birth and taught Braille to children for 40 years. I'm trying to restore it as a tribute to her memory." Something in his voice, a combination of love, loss, and determination, resonated in Sarah's chest like a tuning fork. She found herself stepping out from behind the counter, her usual instinct for invisibility forgotten. "Let me show you what we have," she said, leading him toward the specialty hardware section. "What's your name?" "David," he replied, and his dog's tail wagged once at the sound of his voice. "David Novak. And this is Luna. I'm Sarah Chen. This is my family's store." As they walked through the aisles together, Sarah found herself describing the layout, the organization system, even the way the afternoon light fell across the displays. David listened with the focused attention of someone who had learned to build rich mental pictures from sound and description alone. "You have a beautiful voice," he said suddenly, stopping near the specialty screws. "It's warm and precise at the same time. I can tell you care about this place, about helping people find what they need." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In 28 years, no one had ever called her voice beautiful. No one had ever suggested that her careful attention to detail was anything more than the consolation prize for someone who couldn't offer conventional attractiveness. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. As she helped David select the hardware he needed, Sarah realized she was experiencing something entirely new, a conversation where her appearance was irrelevant, where her worth was measured by her knowledge, her kindness, and the quality of her character. The sun was setting by the time they finished, painting the store in shades of gold and amber. David paid for his purchases and carefully tucked them into a worn leather messenger bag. "Would it be all right if I came back tomorrow?" he asked. "I might need some additional items as I work on the restoration, and I'd appreciate your expertise." "Of course," Sarah said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I'll be here." After David and Luna left, Sarah stood in the empty store, watching their silhouettes disappear down Main Street. For the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow, to the possibility of another conversation where she was valued for who she was rather than judged for who she wasn't. She turned off the lights and locked the door, but the warmth in her chest remained, a small flame of hope in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and for once, Sarah Chen allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved them. Outside, the first stars appeared in the Minnesota sky, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, marking the end of one day and the quiet promise of another. Hey there, incredible souls. I hope Sarah's story is touching your heart as much as it's touching mine. If you're listening from your car during your commute, your cozy living room, or anywhere else this story has found you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're experiencing this journey. And if you're feeling the magic of this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of believers in the power of authentic human connection. There's so much more of Sarah and David's story to unfold, and I can't wait to share it with you. Sarah arrived at the hardware store 30 minutes early the next morning, something she hadn't done since her father's funeral 3 years ago. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Main Street was still quiet, except for the distant hum of the grain elevator and the occasional pickup truck heading toward the farming districts outside town. She unlocked the door with hands that trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from an unfamiliar anticipation that had kept her awake most of the night. As she flipped on the lights and started her usual opening routine, Sarah caught herself humming, a sound so rare in the empty store that it startled her into silence. The morning customers arrived in their predictable patterns, old Pete needing pipe fittings for his perpetually leaking farmhouse, the Martinez family searching for cabinet hinges for their kitchen renovation, and a steady stream of contractors picking up supplies for the day's projects. But with each chime of the bell, Sarah found herself looking up hopefully, then feeling a small stab of disappointment when it wasn't David. By 11 o'clock, she began to wonder if yesterday had been some kind of beautiful dream, a moment of connection that existed only in her imagination. She was reorganizing the electrical supplies section when she heard it, the distinctive tap of a white cane against concrete, accompanied by the soft padding of Luna's paws. "Good morning, Sarah," David's voice called out as he entered, and the warmth in his greeting made something flutter in her chest like a bird taking flight. "Good morning," she replied, stepping out from behind a display of outlet covers. "How did the restoration work go yesterday evening?" David's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Better than I hoped. The springs you helped me find were perfect. They had exactly the right tension. My grandmother's typewriter is starting to come back to life, one piece at a time." Luna settled herself beside the counter with the practiced ease of a working dog, her intelligent eyes alert but relaxed. Sarah had never been around guide dogs before and found herself fascinated by the partnership between David and his companion. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, gesturing toward Luna before catching herself. "I mean, she is beautiful," David agreed with a smile, "and she knows it. Luna's a bit vain, actually. She preens whenever people compliment her." As if on cue, Luna's tail gave a single dignified wag. Sarah laughed, a genuine surprised sound that seemed to echo strangely in the familiar space of the store. When was the last time she had laughed like that? The realization that she couldn't remember made her chest tighten with a sadness she thought she'd made peace with years ago. "I brought something to show you," David said, reaching into his messenger bag. He pulled out a small, intricate piece of brass machinery, part of the typewriter's mechanism, polished to a warm golden sheen. "This is the key lever assembly. Each letter is connected to one of these, and when you press a key, it activates a series of pins that create the braille dots on paper." Sarah leaned closer to examine the piece, struck by the elegant complexity of the design. "It's like mechanical poetry," she said softly. "All these tiny parts working together to create language." "That's exactly how my grandmother described it," David said, his voice filled with surprise and something deeper, recognition. "She used to say that Braille wasn't just reading with your fingers, it was feeling the shape of thoughts made real." They spent the next hour exploring the store together as David selected additional hardware for the restoration. Sarah found herself describing everything in vivid detail: the way the morning light slanted through the windows, the organization system her father had developed, even the small imperfections that gave the old building character. "There's a water stain on the ceiling above the paint section," she said as they passed beneath it. "It looks like a bird in flight, wings spread wide. My father always said it was his guardian angel watching over the store." "Tell me about your father," David said, pausing near the display of hand tools. "I can hear the love in your voice when you mention him." Sarah felt her throat constrict with familiar grief. He was the only person who ever made me feel like I was enough just as I am. When kids at school would tease me about my birthmark, he'd take me fishing at Miller's Pond and tell me stories about famous people throughout history who were considered different but changed the world anyway. He sounds like a wise man. He was. When he died, I thought... Sarah paused, surprised by her own openness. She never talked about her father with customers, never shared personal details with anyone in Millbrook, but something about David's presence invited honesty. I thought maybe the part of me that believed I had value died with him. David stopped walking and turned toward her voice with complete attention. "But you kept the store running. You maintained everything he built." That takes tremendous strength, or tremendous stubbornness, Sarah said with a self-deprecating laugh. Sometimes they're the same thing, David replied gently. My grandmother used to say that stubbornness was just hope wearing work clothes. The bell chimed, and Mrs. Patterson, formerly Jenny Morrison, the same girl who had declared Sarah unmarriageable at age 7, entered with her characteristic air of self-importance. She was followed by her sister-in-law, Rebecca, both women carrying coffee cups from the new boutique cafe that had opened across the street. Oh, Jenny said, her voice carrying that familiar note of forced sympathy. Sarah, I didn't know you had company. Sarah felt her old instincts kick in, the urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, to make herself small so others could feel more comfortable. But David's presence beside her felt like an anchor, steady and reassuring. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Patterson, Sarah said with professional courtesy. This is David Novak. He's working on restoring a vintage Braille typewriter. How interesting, Jenny said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Her eyes darted between Sarah and David with undisguised curiosity, clearly trying to understand the dynamic between them. David, Sarah continued, these are two of our long-time customers. David stepped forward with the confident grace Sarah was beginning to associate with him. Pleasure to meet you both. Sarah has been incredibly helpful. She has an amazing knowledge of hardware and an eye for finding exactly what people need. Rebecca looked startled by the genuine appreciation in David's voice. Oh, well, yes, Sarah's always been very thorough. The word thorough hung in the air like a polite insult, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could retreat into her usual defensive posture, David spoke again. Thorough is exactly right, and patient and insightful. She's been helping me understand the mechanical poetry of my grandmother's typewriter. It's rare to find someone who can see the beauty in functional design. Jenny's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. In all the years she'd known Sarah, no one had ever described her in terms of beauty, even metaphorically. The compliment seemed to reshape the air in the store, creating a space where Sarah existed as someone valuable rather than someone to be pitied. We just need some picture-hanging hardware, Rebecca said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in dynamics. As Sarah helped them find what they needed, she was acutely aware of the whispered conversation happening between the sisters-in-law. She caught fragments. Blind so he can't seize, and probably just being nice. And still it's sweet of him. The words stung, but they felt different somehow. Less like universal truths and more like the small-minded opinions of people who couldn't imagine a world beyond their own limited perspective. After the Patterson women left, David shook his head with a slight frown. Some people, he said quietly, have lost the ability to recognize genuine connection when they see it. You heard all that? Sarah asked, embarrassed. I hear a lot of things people don't realize they're revealing, David said, but I also hear what matters most. The warmth in your voice when you talk about things you care about, the way you take time to explain details that help me visualize what I'm working with. Those women can't hear any of that because they're too busy looking at surfaces. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar weight of shame, but something lighter, stronger. Is that what you do? Listen to what people don't know they're saying? It's one of the gifts of blindness, David said with a slight smile. When you can't see faces, you learn to hear souls. They worked together for another hour, and Sarah found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone, about her father's dreams for expanding the store, about her love of organizing systems that made sense, about the satisfaction she found in helping people solve practical problems. David, in turn, told her about his work as a piano tuner, how he'd lost his sight gradually to a genetic condition in his 20s, and how the experience had taught him that the most important things in life were invisible anyway. My grandmother always said that people spend so much time looking at each other that they forget to see each other, he said as they finished selecting the last pieces he needed. She was the wisest person I ever knew, and she was blind from birth. She taught me that real beauty isn't something you see, it's something you feel. As David prepared to leave, he turned back towards Sarah with a question that made her heart skip. Would you be interested in seeing the typewriter when I have it fully restored? I think you'd appreciate the craftsmanship, and I'd love to show you how all these pieces we've been selecting come together. I'd like that very much, Sarah said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. After David and Luna left, Sarah stood in the quiet store, watching their figures disappear down Main Street. For the first time in her adult life, she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who valued her mind, her kindness, and her knowledge above all else. She touched the birthmark on her cheek, a gesture that had always been one of shame or self-consciousness, but today it felt different. Today it felt like just another part of who she was, not a flaw to be hidden, but simply one element of a person who was finally beginning to understand her own worth. Outside, the October sun painted Main Street in shades of gold and amber, and Sarah Chen allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when we stop looking and finally start listening. 3 days later, David called the hardware store just as Sarah was preparing to close. His voice carried an excitement she hadn't heard before, bubbling with the kind of joy that comes from completing something meaningful. "Sarah, I finished it," he said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "The typewriter is fully restored. Would you like to come see it?" "I know it's short notice, but I'm too excited to wait until tomorrow." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. In her 28 years, she'd never been invited to a man's home, not for dinner, not for coffee, not for anything. The invitation felt both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff with wings she wasn't sure would work. Yes, she heard herself say. "I'd love to see it." David's apartment was a 15-minute walk from Main Street, in a converted Victorian house that had been divided into 4 units. As Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor, she noticed how the old banister had been wrapped with textured tape at regular intervals, modifications that would help David navigate safely. When he opened the door, Luna greeted Sarah with a gentle tail wag, as if welcoming an old friend. The apartment itself was a revelation, organized with mathematical precision, but warm and lived in. Every piece of furniture had its designated place. Every surface was clear of clutter, yet the space felt more like a home than Sarah's own cluttered house ever had. "Welcome to my organized chaos," David said with a grin, leading her toward the living room. "Everything has its place here, much like your hardware store." What struck Sarah most was the absence of visual decoration. There were no paintings on the walls, no ornamental objects cluttering shelves. Instead, the apartment was filled with textures. A soft wool throw draped over the leather couch, books with raised lettering arranged on floating shelves, and in the corner, gleaming under a carefully positioned lamp, sat the restored Braille typewriter. "Oh my goodness," Sarah breathed, approaching the machine with reverence. "It's absolutely beautiful." The typewriter was a work of art. Every brass fitting they'd selected together gleamed with a warm patina. The keys were perfectly aligned, and the mechanism that would create the raised dots was polished to mechanical perfection. But more than its physical beauty, the machine radiated purpose. It was a tool designed to give voice to thoughts, to translate ideas into language that fingers could read. "Would you like to try it?" David asked, positioning himself beside her. "I loaded it with special paper." "I wouldn't know what to type," Sarah said, suddenly self-conscious. "Type whatever comes to mind, the first thing you think of." Sarah sat in the chair David had positioned, her fingers hovering over the keys. The first thing that came to mind surprised her with its honesty. Slowly, carefully, she began to type. "For the first time in my life, someone sees me." The machine responded with quiet mechanical precision, each keystroke creating a pattern of raised dots on the paper. When she finished, David gently removed the paper and ran his fingers across the Braille dots, reading her words through touch. His face transformed as he read, a smile spreading across his features that was both gentle and radiant. "That's beautiful, Sarah, and it's exactly how I feel too, seen for who I really am." They spent the evening exploring the typewriter together, David explaining how his grandmother had used it to write letters, stories, and lesson plans for the children she taught. Sarah found herself captivated not just by the machine, but by the way David's hands moved across it, with loving familiarity, as if he were greeting an old friend. "She used to let me sit beside her when I was young," David said, demonstrating the typewriter's rhythm. "Before I lost my sight, I would watch her fingers dance across the keys, creating language through touch. I think that's when I first understood that there were different ways of seeing the world." "When did you lose your sight?" Sarah asked gently, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. "I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that." "It's all right," David said, settling back in his chair. "I was 23, it was gradual, a genetic condition called Leber hereditary optic neuropathy. I had about 6 months of slowly dimming vision before it went completely dark." He paused, his fingers absently stroking Luna's head. "I won't lie, it was terrifying at first. I thought my life was over." "But it wasn't," Sarah said softly. "No, it wasn't. It was just beginning in a different way. I had to learn to navigate the world through sound, touch, and intuition. And in doing that, I discovered things about people and relationships that I never would have seen with my eyes. Sarah understood what he meant on a level that surprised her. I think I've been blind too, in a way. Blind to my own worth, because I was so focused on what everyone else saw when they looked at me. David turned toward her voice with complete attention. And now, Sarah paused, searching for words to describe the shift happening inside her. Now I'm starting to wonder if maybe there's more to me than I thought. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. David frowned slightly. He clearly wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, Sarah heard a familiar voice that made her stomach clench with old anxiety. "David? It's Mum." The woman's voice was cultured, with the crisp enunciation of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I was in the area and thought I'd check on how you're settling in." Sarah saw David's posture change subtly, a slight stiffening, a careful composure settling over his features. "Of course, Mom, come in." Eleanor Novak was exactly what Sarah had expected from the voice. Elegantly dressed, perfectly coiffed, with the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. She entered the apartment with the assessing gaze of someone used to taking inventory of her surroundings and finding them wanting. "I brought you some of those herbal teas you enjoy," and Eleanor's voice trailed off as she noticed Sarah sitting by the typewriter. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, from maternal concern to polite confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like dismay. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen. She owns Miller's hardware store and has been incredibly helpful with the typewriter restoration. Sarah, this is my mother, Eleanor Novak." Sarah stood, acutely aware of how her simple jeans and sweater must look compared to Eleanor's sophisticated outfit. The older woman's eyes flickered briefly to Sarah's birthmark before settling into the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "How nice to meet you, dear," Eleanor said with practiced politeness. "David mentioned he was working on his grandmother's old typewriter. How helpful of you to assist him." The word helpful carried the same dismissive weight that thorough had in Rebecca Patterson's voice. Sarah felt the familiar urge to apologize for her presence, to make herself smaller so others could be more comfortable. "Sarah has been wonderful," David said firmly, and Sarah heard something protective in his voice. "She found hardware pieces I thought would be impossible to locate. The restoration wouldn't have been possible without her expertise." Eleanor's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure she's very knowledgeable about such things. David, I was hoping we could discuss your plans for Thanksgiving. Your father and I are hosting the Andersons this year. You remember Dr. Anderson's daughter Margaret? She's recently divorced and has moved back to Minneapolis. Such a lovely girl and so accomplished. A pediatrician just like her father." Sarah felt the subtext, like a physical blow. Here was a mother trying to redirect her son towards someone more suitable, someone whose value was measured in professional accomplishments and social status, rather than birthmarks and hardware store knowledge. "Mom," David's voice carried a warning note, "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own social life." "Of course you are, darling. I just thought you might enjoy meeting someone with similar interests, someone who understands the challenges you face." The phrase, "challenges you face," hung in the air like smoke. Sarah understood that she was being positioned as another challenge, something David had to overcome rather than something he might choose. "The only challenge I face," David said quietly, "is people who assume they know what's best for me without bothering to ask what I want." The tension in the room was palpable. Luna, sensing the shift in emotional temperature, moved closer to David's side. Sarah stood frozen by the typewriter, caught between the urge to flee and the strange new impulse to stand her ground. Eleanor's gaze moved between her son and Sarah, calculations visible in her expression. "Well," she said finally, "I should let you get back to your project. David, please consider what I said about Thanksgiving." After Eleanor left, the apartment felt different, smaller somehow, as if her presence had sucked some of the warmth from the space. David stood by the closed door for a long moment, his jaw tight with frustration. "I'm sorry about that," he said finally. "My mother means well, but she has very fixed ideas about how life should work." "She wants what's best for you," Sarah said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "Maybe she's right. Maybe you should meet this Margaret person." David turned toward her voice with something that looked like alarm. "Sarah, no. Don't let her make you doubt what's happening between us." "What is happening between us?" Sarah asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than she'd intended. David crossed to where she stood by the typewriter, stopping close enough that she could smell his aftershave, feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Something real," he said simply. Something that has nothing to do with what anyone else thinks we should be doing, and everything to do with who we actually are. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her hand. His fingers were warm, calloused from his work as a piano tuner and completely steady. "My mother sees my blindness as a limitation," he continued. "She thinks I need someone to take care of me, someone who understands my challenges. But you don't see me as broken or limited. You see me as whole." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "And you see me as more than just damaged goods." "I see you as extraordinary," David said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Intelligent, kind, strong, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with what anyone else's eyes can measure." Standing there in the soft lamplight, with the restored typewriter gleaming beside them and Luna resting peacefully at their feet, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. For 28 years, she had defined herself by other people's limitations, their inability to see past her birthmark to the person beneath. But David's blindness had become a gift that allowed him to see everything that mattered. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "It's getting late." "Let me walk you home," David offered. "Oh, you don't have to." "I want to," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her chest ache with hope. As they walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Luna leading the way with practiced ease, Sarah realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't walking alone. She had found someone who saw her completely, and in doing so, had helped her begin to see herself. The future still felt uncertain. Eleanor Novak's disapproval, the town's inevitable gossip, her own deep-seated fears about being worthy of love. But walking beside David in the crisp October night, Sarah Chen allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some barriers were meant to be broken. "Oh, my heart, beautiful souls, can you feel the tension building?" Eleanor's unexpected arrival just shook everything up, didn't it? I'm so proud of how Sarah is beginning to stand in her worth, even when faced with someone who can't see her value. Whether you're listening while cooking dinner, during your evening walk, or anywhere else this story has found you tonight, I hope you're feeling the power of David's unwavering belief in Sarah's worth. Smash that subscribe button if you're Team Sarah and David, and drop a comment telling me what you think about Eleanor's interference. The next morning brought the kind of November weather that made Millbrook feel like the edge of the world, grey skies pressing down like a heavy blanket, the promise of snow hanging in the air like a held breath. Sarah opened the hardware store with mechanical precision, but her mind kept drifting to the previous evening. David's hands touching hers, his voice saying she was extraordinary, the way her heart had hammered when he'd walked her home. She was arranging paint chips when the bell chimed, and Margaret Anderson walked in. Sarah recognized her immediately, even though they'd never formally met. Margaret had the kind of polished beauty that small towns remembered. Tall, blonde, with the confident bearing of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. She wore a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, and her smile was as perfect as everything else about her. "You must be Sarah," Margaret said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Margaret Anderson. I believe you know David Novak." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Yes, How do you know David?" "Our mothers are old friends," Margaret said, her tone warm but somehow calculating. "Eleanor mentioned that David had been getting help with some project from someone at the hardware store. I thought I'd stop by and introduce myself, since I'll be seeing quite a bit of David over the holidays." The casual certainty in Margaret's voice, "I'll be seeing quite a bit of David," hit Sarah like a physical blow. This was Eleanor's plan in action, the suitable woman being positioned to replace the unsuitable one. "That's nice," Sarah managed, hating how small her voice sounded. Margaret browsed the store with the air of someone making polite conversation while conducting reconnaissance. "David and I actually have a lot in common. I work with special needs children at the hospital. I understand the challenges he faces in ways that..." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly to Sarah's birthmark. "Well, in ways that come from professional experience." The implication was clear. Margaret understood David's blindness as a medical condition to be managed, while Sarah was simply a well-meaning amateur playing out of her league. "I'm hosting a small dinner party this weekend," Margaret continued, selecting a few random items she clearly didn't need. "Nothing fancy, just some friends from medical school who are in town. David seemed very interested when I mentioned it." Each word felt like a small knife. Sarah pictured Margaret's dinner party, sophisticated conversation, professional accomplishments discussed over wine, David surrounded by people who moved in the same educated circles his mother preferred. What place would a hardware store owner would a facial birthmark have in such a gathering? After Margaret left, Sarah sat behind the counter feeling like she'd been hollowed out with a spoon. The confidence she'd been building over the past week crumbled like a house of cards in a strong wind. What had she been thinking? That someone like David, educated, cultured, from a wealthy family, would choose her over someone like Margaret? The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. Every customer seemed to look at her with new eyes, as if word had already spread about her presumptuous attachment to the blind man. Mrs. Henderson made a point of mentioning how lovely it was that that nice doctor girl was back in town, while old Pete asked with genuine concern if she was feeling all right because she looked peaked. When David arrived that afternoon, Sarah's heart performed its familiar flutter, immediately followed by a crash of self-doubt. He looked happy, relaxed, and she found herself wondering if that happiness had anything to do with Margaret Anderson's dinner invitation. "Good afternoon, beautiful," David said, his voice carrying the warmth she'd come to treasure. The endearment, which would have thrilled her yesterday, now felt complicated. Did he call Margaret beautiful too? Did he even realize how the word sounded coming from someone who couldn't see? "Hi," Sarah replied, busying herself with paperwork to avoid looking at him directly. David's expression shifted, his head tilting slightly in the way she'd noticed when he was trying to read a situation through sound and intuition. "Everything all right? You sound distant." "Just busy," Sarah said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "I wanted to thank you again for last night. Having you see the typewriter, sharing that experience with you. It meant more to me than I can express." Sarah nodded, forgetting he couldn't see the gesture. It was interesting. The word interesting fell between them like a stone into still water. David's face reflected confusion and something that looked like hurt. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "Yesterday you called the typewriter beautiful, said it was like mechanical poetry. Today it's just interesting." Before Sarah could answer, the bell chimed again, and Michael Torres entered with his usual Tuesday routine. But today, he wasn't alone. His 12-year-old daughter Carmen was with him, a bright-eyed girl with her father's easy confidence and her mother's delicate features. "Afternoon, Sarah. Carmen's off school today, so she's helping Daddy with errands." Michael's smile was warm and uncomplicated, a reminder of simpler interactions before Sarah's world had become tangled with hope and doubt. Carmen bounced over to the counter, where Sarah kept a small dish of peppermints. "Hi, Miss Sarah. Daddy says you're the smartest person in town when it comes to fixing things." "That's very kind of your father," Sarah said, managing a genuine smile for the first time all day. "Are you sad?" Carmen asked with the direct perception of children. "You look like you're carrying something heavy." Sarah glanced at David, who was listening to the exchange with focused attention. "Sometimes adults have complicated feelings about things, Carmen. My mom says when you're carrying something heavy, it helps to put it down and ask for help," Carmen said matter-of-factly. "She says trying to carry everything by yourself just makes you tired." Michael gathered his supplies with a gentle laugh. "Come on, philosopher. Let's let Miss Sarah get back to work." After they left, the store felt even quieter than before. David remained by the counter, his hands resting on Luna's head, clearly waiting for Sarah to explain what was happening. "Margaret Anderson stopped by this morning," Sarah said finally. "Ah." David's voice carried a note of understanding that made Sarah's chest ache. "And what did the future Dr. Anderson have to say?" "She mentioned a dinner party, said you seemed interested." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently stroking Luna's ears. "My mother called this morning." She'd spoken to Margaret's mother, who had spoken to Margaret, who apparently felt it was important to check on me and make sure I was adjusting well to life in Millbrook. "Are you adjusting well?" "I was," David said softly. "I thought I was building something real here. Something that mattered." The past tense of his words was thought, hit Sarah like a physical blow. "David, no, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "Margaret is a lovely person. She's intelligent, accomplished, comes from the same background as my family. She understands my blindness from a clinical perspective and would probably be very good at managing the practical aspects of life with someone who can't see." Each word felt like a nail in the coffin of Sarah's hopes. "But," David continued, stepping closer to the counter, "she doesn't see me. She sees a condition to be managed, a project to be handled with professional competence. When I talk to her, I feel like she's taking my temperature and checking my pulse, making sure I'm functioning within acceptable parameters." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "When I talk to you," David said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I feel like you're listening to my soul." "But she's perfect for you," Sarah said, the words coming out choked and desperate. She's educated, beautiful from your world. She understands things I never could. She understands blindness, David corrected. You understand me. There's a difference. The bell chimed again, and this time it was Eleanor Novak herself, dressed in a tailored coat and carrying an expression of barely concealed determination. She surveyed the store with the same assessing gaze Sarah remembered from the previous evening, her eyes landing on David with something that looked like relief. David, there you are. I've been calling your apartment. Eleanor's tone carried the authority of someone used to having her calls returned promptly. I turned my phone off, Mom. I was having a conversation. With Miss Chen, I presume. Eleanor's smile was polite but glacial. How fortunate. I was hoping to speak with both of you. Sarah felt dread settle in her stomach like a stone. I had lunch with Dorothy Anderson today, Eleanor continued, and she mentioned that Margaret is very much looking forward to getting to know you better, David. She's such an accomplished young woman, already being considered for a fellowship at Children's Hospital, and her work with disabled children is truly inspiring. The word disabled hung in the air like a slap. Sarah watched David's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Margaret seems to have a real understanding of what your life requires, Eleanor pressed on. The kind of understanding that comes from professional training and personal maturity. The subtext was clear, unlike the amateur sympathy of a small-town shopgirl. Mom, David's voice carried a warning note. I'm simply pointing out that sometimes we think we want one thing when what we actually need is something quite different. Eleanor's gaze moved to Sarah with surgical precision. Miss Chen, I'm sure you understand that David's life involves complexities that might be challenging for someone without experience in these matters. Sarah felt the familiar weight of shame settling over her shoulders like an old coat. Eleanor was right, wasn't she? What did Sarah know about the complexities of David's life? What could she offer someone who needed professional-level understanding and support? Mrs. Novak, Sarah began, her voice barely steady, you don't need to worry about… Actually, David interrupted, his voice carrying a steel Sarah had never heard before. She does need to worry, because the way she's speaking to you right now is completely unacceptable. Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. David, I'm simply being practical. You're being condescending and cruel, David said flatly, to someone who has shown me more genuine kindness and understanding in 1 week than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm thinking of your future. No, you're thinking of your comfort. You're uncomfortable with the fact that I might choose someone who doesn't fit your idea of what my life should look like. The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Luna shifted nervously, sensing the emotional undercurrents flowing around her. Margaret Anderson is a fine person, David continued, but she's not the person I want. And frankly, Mom, even if Sarah weren't in the picture, I still wouldn't be interested in dating someone my mother selected for me, like I'm some kind of prize bull being matched for breeding. Eleanor's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. David, you're being deliberately crude. I'm being honest, something I should have done years ago. Eleanor gathered her composure with visible effort, her gaze moving between David and Sarah with calculating coldness. Very well, but I think you'll find that infatuation and real compatibility are very different things. Miss Chen, I hope you'll consider what's truly best for David, rather than what might be flattering to your ego. After Eleanor left, the store felt like a battlefield. Sarah stood behind the counter, shaking with a combination of humiliation and fury. David remained where he was, his hands clenched at his sides, breathing deeply as if trying to regain his equilibrium. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm so sorry you had to hear that. She's not wrong, Sarah whispered. I don't know anything about your life, about what you need. Maybe I am just being selfish. Sarah, no. David moved around the counter until he was standing directly in front of her. Don't let her poison what we have. What do we have? Sarah asked, the question coming out raw and desperate. Really? What can I offer you that someone like Margaret can't offer better? David reached out slowly, his hands finding her face with gentle precision. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, one finger brushing softly across her birthmark. You offer yourself, he said simply. Your curiosity, your kindness, your strength. You offer conversations that make me think and laugh and feel understood. You offer a love that sees me as whole rather than broken. Love, Sarah's voice caught on the word. Yes, David said, his voice steady and sure. Love, real, honest, imperfect, beautiful love. Standing there in the grey afternoon light With the weight of Eleanor's disapproval and Margaret's perfection pressing down around them, Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could retreat into the safety of self-doubt, accept that someone like her wasn't meant for someone like him, or she could fight for the connection that had already transformed her understanding of her own worth. The decision, she realized, would determine not just her future with David, but her future with herself. My incredible listeners, I can barely breathe after this chapter. The way David defended Sarah against his mother's cruel words, did you feel that fire? But oh, that doubt creeping into Sarah's heart is so real, so human. Whether you're listening during your lunch break, on your commute, or wherever this story has found you today, I need you to know that this moment of choice Sarah is facing. We've all been there. Hit that subscribe button if you believe love is worth fighting for, and drop a comment telling me, what would you do in Sarah's shoes? Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling her father had painted sky blue when she was 7, trying to quiet the war raging in her mind. Eleanor's words echoed like a broken record. Complexities that might be challenging, professional training and personal maturity, what's truly best for David. But louder still was David's voice saying love with such certainty, such conviction, that it had shaken something loose inside her chest. When dawn finally crept through her curtains, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She dressed carefully, not in her usual oversized cardigan and jeans, but in a soft blue sweater her father had bought her years ago, one she'd never had the courage to wear because it actually fit properly and didn't hide her figure. She applied a touch of makeup, not to cover her birthmark, but to enhance her eyes, the feature her father had always said reminded him of her mother. The November morning was crisp and bright, the kind of day that made Millbrook look like a postcard. Sarah walked to the hardware store with purpose in her step, but instead of opening immediately, she flipped the sign to "Back in 30 minutes" and continued down Main Street. Margaret Anderson was staying at the Millbrook Inn, the town's only hotel, a charming Victorian building that catered to leaf peepers and business travelers. Sarah found her in the dining room, elegantly dressed even at breakfast, reading what looked like a medical journal while sipping coffee. "Margaret?" Sarah's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I'm Sarah Chen. We met yesterday at the hardware store." Margaret looked up with surprise, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Of course, please sit down. Would you like some coffee?" Sarah accepted the coffee more for something to do with her hands than from any desire to drink it. Up close, Margaret was even more beautiful than she'd appeared in the store, the kind of effortless elegance that came from good genes and excellent healthcare. "I wanted to talk to you about David," Sarah said, diving in before she could lose her nerve. Margaret's smile was professional, the kind doctors probably learned in medical school for delivering difficult news. "I thought you might. Eleanor mentioned that you and David have become pretty close." "We have," Sarah said simply. "I love him." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "I'm sure you do," Margaret said, her tone gentle but patronizing. "David has a way of inspiring protective feelings in people. It's natural to want to help someone who faces the challenges he does." "That's not what this is," Sarah said firmly. "I don't love David because I want to help him. I love him because of who he is. His humor, his intelligence, the way he sees beauty in things others miss. I love him because he makes me feel like the best version of myself." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the clinical assessment she'd probably perfected during her residency. "Sarah, can I speak frankly? I've worked with patients like David for years. Blindness affects every aspect of daily life. Navigation, communication, employment, social interactions. It requires understanding, patience, and often professional-level support systems. David doesn't need to be managed," Sarah said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "He needs to be loved." "Of course," Margaret said quickly, "but love isn't always enough. What happens when he needs specialized equipment, when he faces discrimination in employment, when social situations become complicated because people don't know how to interact with him? These aren't theoretical problems, Sarah. They're daily realities." Sarah felt the familiar weight of inadequacy pressing down on her shoulders. Margaret was right about the challenges. Sarah had seen them herself in the way people stared at David and Luna, the careful way strangers spoke to him as if blindness affected his hearing. "You care about him," Margaret continued, her voice softening with what seemed like genuine concern. "I can see that. But caring and being equipped to build a life together are different things. David deserves someone who can navigate his world with confidence, who understands the medical and social complexities of his condition." "And you think that's you?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret's smile was sad but certain. "I think I have training and experience that could make his life easier. I understand the healthcare system. I know how to advocate for disability accommodations. I move in circles where his blindness would be understood rather than pitied or feared." The conversation felt like a chess match where Sarah was several moves behind. Everything Margaret said made logical sense. Who was Sarah to argue with medical expertise and professional experience? But then she remembered David's hands on the typewriter keys, the joy in his voice when he talked about his grandmother, the way he'd defended her against his mother's cruelty. She remembered typing, "For the first time in my life, someone sees me," and the way his face had transformed when he read those words. "Margaret," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "you're absolutely right about the challenges David faces, and you're probably right that you'd be better equipped to handle many of them than I am." Margaret nodded, clearly expecting Sarah to concede defeat. "But there's something you don't understand," Sarah continued. "David doesn't want to be handled. He wants to be loved. Not loved despite his blindness. Not loved with professional competence, but loved completely, authentically, for exactly who he is." "I would love him. You would love the idea of him," Sarah interrupted gently. "You'd love the project of optimizing his life, of being the perfect partner who makes everything easier. But David doesn't need easier. He needs real." Margaret's composure slipped slightly. "And you think you can give him that?" "I think I already am," Sarah said, standing up from the table. "Thank you for the coffee, Margaret. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it isn't David." Walking back to the hardware store, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before, the solid weight of her own conviction. She'd faced down the beautiful, accomplished woman who represented everything she'd been told she wasn't, and she'd held her ground. The store felt different when she opened it, as if the very air had changed composition. When David arrived that afternoon, Sarah was ready for him in a way she'd never been ready for anything in her life. "You look..." David paused just inside the door, his head tilting in that familiar way. "You sound different, stronger." "I am different," Sarah said, coming out from behind the counter to stand directly in front of him. "I talked to Margaret this morning." David's expression grew cautious. "How did that go?" "She made some very good points about why she'd be better for you than I am," Sarah said, watching David's face carefully. "She's right about a lot of things. She understands your world in ways I don't. She has training and experience I'll never have." David's jaw tightened. "Sarah, but here's what she doesn't understand," Sarah continued, stepping closer until she was near enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "She doesn't understand that you don't want perfect, you want real. She doesn't understand that love isn't about managing someone's challenges. It's about choosing to walk through life together, challenges and all." David's face transformed, hope and relief and something deeper flooding his features. "I love you," Sarah said, the words coming out clear and strong. "Not because I feel sorry for you, not because I want to fix you, not because I think you need me. I love you because you make me laugh, because you see beauty in things others miss, because you believed I was extraordinary before I believed it myself." "Sarah," David breathed, reaching for her hands, "I love you because when you touch the braille on that typewriter, I can see your grandmother's love in your fingers. I love you because you hear souls instead of just voices. I love you because you taught me that the most important things in life are invisible anyway." David pulled her closer, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Say it again." "I love you," Sarah whispered. "Again. I love you, David Novak. Completely, imperfectly, authentically, I love you. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the romantic fantasies Sarah had imagined during lonely nights. It was better, real, warm, tasting faintly of coffee and hope. His hands were gentle but sure, and when they broke apart, Sarah felt like she'd been holding her breath for 28 years and could finally exhale. "What happens now?" she asked, her forehead resting against his. "Now we figure it out together," David said simply. "Margaret, my mother, the whole town, they can all have their opinions, but this is our choice, our life, our love." The bell chimed, and they stepped apart to see Michael Torres entering with Carmen. The little girl took one look at them and grinned. "Daddy, look, Miss Sarah doesn't look like she's carrying anything heavy anymore." Michael's eyes moved between Sarah and David, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned. Good for you, Sarah." That evening, as David walked Sarah home through the November twilight, they talked about everything and nothing. His grandmother's stories, Sarah's memories of her father, their hopes for the hardware store, his work tuning pianos, They talked like people who had all the time in the world and knew they wanted to spend it together. "My mother isn't going to give up easily," David warned as they reached Sarah's front porch. "I know," Sarah said, and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. "But I'm not the same person I was yesterday. I found my voice today, David, and I'm not planning to lose it again." Standing under the porch light, with Luna sitting patiently beside them and the whole town of Millbrook spread out in the darkness beyond, Sarah Chen finally understood what her father had tried to teach her all those years ago, that she was enough, exactly as she was, birthmark and all. The future still held uncertainties, Eleanor's continued opposition, the town's inevitable gossip, the daily challenges of building a life together. But for the first time in her 28 years, Sarah faced the unknown with confidence instead of fear. She had found her voice and she had found her love. Everything else they would figure out together.